I'm not going to be talking about open source software, which is quite unusual for me at the moment. I'm going to be talking about open source ideas and looking at them in a far broader context than just the software. I'm not here to sell open source software licenses, which is a great shame, because when I do, I normally get about 50% commission on those things. My day job is as senior lecturer in ICT education at Roehampton University, which is a great job. I've only been doing it for a year now. Up until then, I was a primary school teacher, so I moved from primary school world into higher education, and I'm enjoying a lot of the freedom that this brings about writing our own courses, writing our own exams, coming up with our own assessment strategies, which is a wonderful thing. And there's something which open source has to say about that. What is open source? Well, it's a bit like this. Hands up the cookery people, cookery fans in the room. There's a few of you. So open source is like having the recipe book. It's, you know, how you make the stuff for yourself. Fine, you can go and get some food at Sainsbury's, you can go and get some food at fast food restaurants that Phil was mentioning. There's plenty of ways of eating, but if you've got the recipe, then you've got the opportunity to adapt it, to make it special, to make it suit your particular family, to make it suit your particular palate. And open source is kind of like that. More to the point, you get an understanding of how people put food together. You're part of that sort of community, that chain from the producers through to your family when they're having their meals. So, okay, it's not going to be there every single meal. You're not going to want to cook every meal yourself. But having the opportunity to cook some meals, the special occasions, when it's something really important for yourself, to be able to adapt that as a good thing. So open source, a bit like the recipe books. There are some analogies we use. When we talk about open source software, we talk about free software, and most people think that means we don't have to pay for it. And of course, you don't have to pay for it. It is free as in beer, gratuité as the French would have it. The other side of this is the free as in speech, the liberté as the French would have it. And that's really very much an important part of the open source vision, that it's about software which has at its core ideas of freedom. And again, I think there are implications there outside of software development. A third option, we've got free as in beer, we've got free as in speech. We also, of course, have free as in kittens, in that whilst the initial cost may be zero, there are, of course, running costs that you need to take into account. That said, aren't they cute? Aren't they adorable? Everybody go, ah, please. Ah, okay? And of course, you get to see how they develop. You get to know these things as they grow up. So free as in kittens, not necessarily a bad thing. Okay, lots and lots of open source in education, lots and lots of open source being used as the engine that drives the web. Is there anybody in the room who can identify all of the open source projects up on the screen in front of them, please? Well done, thank you very much. Are they sandals you're wearing? Is that a glass of real ale you're looking for? The drinks afterwards. Well done, though. Some brilliant, brilliant projects. As I say, I'm not here to sell open source. No, so, you know, go and find out about these things. They are great. The one over on that side, Moodle, I guess people have heard about, and others. What about these three people? I want to think about open source as a way of thinking about education and the links between open source as a development methodology and some of the ways which we think about education. What about the three faces on the screen now? Can anybody name all three of them? I'm not seeing any hands up. Okay, I'm an education lecturer, I'm allowed to do this sort of thing. On the left, we've got Piaget, and that vision of education as about making a mental model of understanding how the world works. Anybody in the room who's coded open source software? Excellent, thank you very much. Well done. This approach to, this idea of the mental model building is what goes on when you write code. You've got your mental model of how the software's going to work, what it's supposed to do, and of course it doesn't do that. And Piaget would have talked about cognitive conflict and a process of accommodation there as you learn through the process of writing that software. And so exposing our learners to that experience, probably a good thing. What about the chap in the middle? Anybody like to have a go at him? Vygotsky, of course, yes. We are social constructivists. I teach at Roehampton. I'm a social constructivist. You know, that's what we do. So we have this idea that meaning, our understanding of the world, is something which we develop through conversation with other people. Open source software, the best of it, gets written through collaboration, through community projects, through people talking to one another, through exchanging ideas on mailing lists, bouncing those ideas around. So we have that sense of the social construction of a piece of software, if not necessarily meaning all of the time. And the chap on the right, anybody? Not Stallman, although I can tell, I can see the similarity. Right. Seymour Papert, thank you very much, Drew. Good to have you here. So we have Seymour Papert, who did a lot of the great foundation work about ICT in a school's context, or computing in a school's context. And this model he had, or the idea he had, of constructionism, that we learn best, not simply when we explore things for ourselves and learn through playing, not simply when we talk to the people around us, but actually when we settle down and get something done, when we build something for other people to see. And I hope you can see how open source software fits exactly into that paradigm. Yeah? It embodies our understanding of what software should do. Okay. Eric Raymond, another of great heroes of the open source movement, talks about this brilliant essay. Google it, those of you who've got machines open, The Cathedral and the Bazaar. Could you stop, pause for a moment, think about your home educational institution, your school, your college, your university, and ask yourself, which of these is it closest to? Is it a little bit more like a cathedral, or is it a little bit more like a bazaar? Could you put your hand up, please, if you're in the cathedral half of the room? Thank you. Could you put your hand up, please, if you're in the bazaar half of the room? Okay, for those in the bazaar half, open source ideas, open source principles are, I hope, exactly what you're doing in your institution. Some of these ways of thinking about creating knowledge artifacts are what your university is about. Those of you who put your hand up for Cathedral, let's see those hands again, please, the Cathedral half of the room. Could you keep your hand up if you're very happy with it being like a cathedral? Interesting. I hope the rest of the talk might give you some ideas about, open source, how it might be useful for our institution too. Okay, open source based on, or the free software movement based on 4 freedoms. And again, don't think simply in terms of software. Think about what this means either for education as a whole or for open education resources, if you want to think of it in that particular narrow spectrum. Firstly, open source, one of the freedoms is that the software should be free to run. It should be there without cost, okay? So no need to pay in order to get degrees. It's a noble idea, isn't it? It also ought to be there free for anybody. There shouldn't be any artificial barriers put in the way of anybody being able to use the software. That means irrespective of price, irrespective of gender, irrespective of background, irrespective of pretty much anything, it is there free for all. And I hope the same is true of any open education resources. And wouldn't it be lovely if the same was true of our education system? What about the other one? Next freedom, free to study how the program works. Well, it's kind of difficult to think what that means in terms of education, but perhaps access to the source code of education means that understanding of the process we go through when we create our courses, rather than just sharing the PowerPoint slides or sharing the podcasts of our lectures, actually exposing some of the thought that's gone into that and some of the thinking behind what it is that we teach, how it is we work as an institution. Free to redistribute the program. So again, with the resources you produce, have those as things which people can share freely beyond the institution. Again, thinking of that wider audience for the stuff. Also, of course, free to share the education. Well, that's kind of what we do, isn't it? Those that we educate go on and educate others. So I think we're doing all right on that one, really. What about this one, though? How much of this do we really have? How much of this freedom do we get in our institutions? Free to improve on what's there already. And it's great that we have these podcasts, and it's great that we have our MIT OpenCourseware and OU's open content offerings and all of this stuff. But wouldn't it be nice if we could do more with that and perhaps work with other people, or perhaps take that stuff and tweak it and make it better, make it more appropriate for our context, and put something back towards those who created. This is how knowledge works. This is how knowledge gets socially constructed, that we build on what others have built already. Why not do this with education? Why not do this with education resources? Okay, so some of the common characteristics of open source projects and what they might mean for education. Firstly, open source, the best of it, gets built by a community of users working together. And there is this Lars Wenger thing about legitimate peripheral participation, that it's very easy for anybody, the end user, to have some input into the process by spotting the things which aren't working as they should, by suggesting things that it would be lovely if it could do. Now, I hope your approach to student voice provides an opportunity for your students to have that sort of peripheral participation into what their courses are like, the way things get done in your institution. A little closer to the Bazaar than the Cathedral in terms of where the voice of authority is. It's all of us working together to make this better. Okay, another Eric Raymond quote, "To many eyes all bugs are shallow," that if you've got enough people working together to solve a problem, then any of those little things that need ironing out, any of those mistakes in the source code in a software context, become things which we together as a team can solve. And what a shame it is that so much of education is the voice of authority. It's the senior leadership team in school, or it's the academics in the higher education institution, when we're missing out on the expertise of so many other people who could contribute to making that better. You also, with open source, get this idea of the modular approach. Not with every project, but with things like Moodle. You know how easy it is to fit an extra module into Moodle or add in filters. It's easy to plug and play, to take one bit from one area and add it into another, much like the way Lego bricks work. And perhaps that's something which we ought to allow more opportunity for when it comes to putting education together for ourselves. Think about how you learn something. Do you enroll on the course, study that exclusively, or do you actually use Google and read and just look at all of these wonderful different sources for information which plug together to make your holistic education? It's no longer that single monolithic authority. Anybody figure out what this is a Lego model of? Babbage's engine, well done, thank you. Okay, and the French have this lovely word, bricolage. Joe Dale here was probably embarrassed by my presentation of this, which is this idea that, you know, we can tweak things, we can tinker with things. You get this with open source. And of course, bricolage is a serious, proper academic word. We can put that in journal articles and people think that's quite respectable. I suppose close translation into English would be tinkering or DIY, which is harder to get away with perhaps in your paper titles. But this idea that our education is something which we do for ourselves rather than it's there as the commodity which we buy off the shelf. You know, think in terms of exam systems. Okay, the accreditation, the certification does matter for many, many people, but we're getting to a point, I suspect, where it's no longer enough. You know, 3 grade A levels, a degree, it's no longer enough to land that job to move on to that next step. What matters is the stuff you've done yourself. So moving away again from the voice of the cathedral to the process of the bazaar or the DIY shop, if you wish. Also, of course, this idea of version control, that we can look at the history of the stuff that we've produced, that we can go back, we can look at the changes. Again, if you're going to have something which is developed within a community, you need some system for managing all of those ideas which are all coming together. And I think this is one of the faults with Moodle, that Moodle doesn't actually allow us to work very easily, collaboratively on a course. Anybody recognize the text? Okay, I'll leave that as an exercise then. Open source is a great source for innovation as well. When you think of some of, Moodle really pushed the boundaries back at its start about what a virtual learning environment can do. Something like Ulcc pushing the boundaries in terms of social networking within the institution. So many really, really exciting things coming through a culture of innovation within that open source community. Look at the web, look at how much of that relies on open source technology. So again, using this collaborative, community-based, everybody can participate in this is a great way of getting innovation into the courses you deliver, into the education that's presented at your institution. And of course, the money side of things, that perhaps by having this community-sourced approach to education, we do actually get to save some money. The other side of this is this argument that, well, nobody's going to write open source software for free. They're all getting paid somewhere. Well, yes, but very often the medium of exchange isn't a financial one. A lot of folks write open source software or contribute to open source documentation because of this sort of idea of kudos, the respect of one's peers. And of course, that's something which academics are kind of used to with the sort of peer-reviewed articles. But it's also something which perhaps has its place in collaborative course design and that broader vision of what education should be about. We don't do it for the money. Is there anybody in the room who's doing this for the money, by the way? Okay, we do it because it's a thing worth doing, and also, perhaps, because folks say we're doing a good job a lot of the time. Okay, I want to talk briefly about open education resources, and you've got a couple of ways of thinking about this. Over on this side of the screen, you've got the sort of cathedral approach to open education resources. You know, a lot of our cathedrals, they will let you in for free, but basically you get what they give you. You're allowed in, you're allowed to go and soak up the atmosphere of the space, but, you know, that is the offering. Okay, you can take that away with you, you can take some of the atmosphere, but you don't, this side is much more the Bazaar model of, Bazaar, not bizarre, model of open education resources, the Wikipedia idea. Now, I don't know, which do you go? Where do you go to? Where would you rather go to find out about something new? Do you go to Wikipedia, or do you hunt through the stuff on MIT courseware and other open education resources sites? Who goes to iTunes? You. Who goes to Wikipedia? Let's do a show of hands. Who's sort of coming down on this Bazaar side? The Wikipedia is the place I would tend to go. Who's going on to the other side, you know, the iTunes U side of things? That's fine. We respect you. That's absolutely okay. But again, you know, you have those two things. And if, for us, we actually quite like to go to this side of the list here, the stuff that we can contribute to, that if we spot a mistake on it, we're empowered to change that, then why not also for our learners? Yeah? Just one brief dig at Moodle. I'm great Moodle. I love Moodle, okay? One has to say that. But, okay, I've been Moodling since like version 1.3, 2003 or thereabouts. But one of the things which has been such a disappointment with Moodle, that we have this great open source learning platform, and yet everybody's courses are their own courses. Now, I know Ian's over there, and Ian's done brilliant work about sharing Moodle courses in Buckinghamshire and getting teachers to work together on those. I hope you have those success stories too. But wouldn't it be lovely if more of the courses which we spend our time developing in Moodle are things which we actually share with a wider audience, and rather than just letting them download a thing and work on that, well, how about a way of collaborating together to make a shared Moodle course that is better than what any of us could do on our own? Be a nice thing to do. One of the problems, of course, is that you don't get version control in Moodle, so you can't roll back the changes that somebody makes. Once you're a teacher with editing privileges on a course, you delete everything, that's it, it's gone, unless you've kept a good backup, or rather your e-learning team have kept a good backup for you. Okay, this great open source hero, anybody recognize the picture? Okay, George Osborne, here we go.
Open source politics. Open source software is the idea that there is this software program on the internet and anyone can write the code for it, and it can be used in all sorts of different applications. Open source politics is a similar idea. Here are problems out in our society. Instead of relying on politicians, government ministers, white or civil servants to have a monopoly of wisdom on how to solve that problem, you would engage through the internet, through the technology available these days, in getting the whole of the public, or as many of the public are interested in, solving a particular problem. You could start at a very local level. You might have a particular community problem, crime in a particular street, or a problem with a particular school, and engage the community in finding a solution to that. But you can also envisage it at a national level. For example, we've just had debates and votes in the House of Commons on complicated issues around human embryology and abortion and so on. Well, those are issues that many people in the public understand just as well as any politician. Why not engage them in a decision like that?
Okay, it may not go down well with everybody in the room, but there are connections there between his talk of an open source approach to politics and what might be at the heart of a vision for the big society. And of course, remember, open source can be a lot cheaper than the commercial proprietary alternatives. I draw no conclusions there. The link at the bottom, I've not mentioned the wonderful people who've shared their photographs with the world under Creative Commons licenses, but it's worth mentioning these people, usnowfilm.com. If you go to their site and have a look through their clips library, they've got some interesting people talking about this open source idea or open source approach to things broader even than education, open source approach to politics, to democracy. They've got George Osborne, as you've just seen. They also have a chap called, what was his name again? Ed Miliband, which I think I've caught his name on the news recently, and Alan Cox, Linux kernel hacker for the geeks with me in the room, and Matthew Taylor of the RSA and Clay Shirky. So go and have a look at that and see what far, far more eminent people are talking about open source in a much broader agenda. A couple of book plugs. Future Lab from, 5 years ago now, Open Source Approaches to Education. They've covered very similar territory, far more eloquently than I've done today, and a Demos thing, which you're going to really have to Google for, because it's kind of tricky to track down now, about open source approaches to democracy, open source approaches to politics. What it's about, creating a culture of collaboration, seeing it not simply as here is content to be delivered, here is content to be delivered as efficiently, as effectively as we possibly can. But actually, we're in this together, let's work together to make this much, much better, which is how the best of open source software gets written. And I'm sure it's how we can all work together to make education far better than perhaps it is at the moment. If you want to get in touch, I'm involved with this project called the Open Source Schools Community, which is teachers, techies, school leaders, folks who are who are using open source across the schools sector, initially funded by Vector. There's a website for that up on the screen. I do tweet as mberry, and there's one of my many email addresses up on the screen if you'd like to follow anything up afterwards. Thank you very much.